this study is about the importance of regulating language in the workplace, and it looks at the markers of trust and dehumanization in this, in terms of how we use language. And so the question here was if there's any empirical relation between intergroup dehumanization and trust during asymmetric conflicts. And so the authors sourced conventional and social media reports at the height of the Muslim-Christian intergroup conflict, and I believe this is in the Philippines, from a day after the armed clash on January 26, 2015, until 5 weeks later on February 28. They applied these mathematical procedures to their data corpus through text mining, and this corpus consists of newspaper articles and Facebook public posts. They also computed for correlational links between trust and dehumanization utterances during the Mama Sapano controversy. And what they found here was that an identical set of conflict utterances evokes a greater sense of dehumanization from the low power group, while the high power group remains relatively unperturbed. They also found that high trust towards one's in-group goes hand in hand with dehumanizing the enemy. And then that the language of dehumanization occurs through negative religious images. And in the case of the Christian-Muslim conflict, the word kafir or unbeliever was used for Christians, and then Muslims are dehumanized in this way through use of words like Satanas or Satan and demonio or demon. And so kind of how Anupri related this to the workplace was both about building trust and building strong mechanisms against dehumanization. In terms of building trust, the importance of building trust between communities and departments is an important investment of time. And so looking at who's the in-group, who the out-group is in the social environment. And if you notice that a department has great synergy, they also may see other departments as the other. And so this isn't unhealthy. And so kind of looking at that deeper and enacting some sort of changes there may be helpful. And then building strong mechanisms against dehumanization kind of relates to that. There's a lot of online platforms that have policies against hate speech, and similarly at work, there can be subtle forms of dehumanization that can take place, sometimes through innocent slurs. And so noticing the language of employees while addressing each other behind closed doors is pretty important and can show kind of who's, what bias looks like there and what stereotypes might be being used. I think this kind of like, this reminds me of sort of a reframing of language and how you communicate ideas to one another and how you react to another. I know we have some clients that it's not necessarily the content of what's being spoken about, but how it's being portrayed that can really affect how it's received by the other end. And so in some ways looking at how do we say things respectfully and with regard for the other person, I think is important and kind of relates to this study.
Interesting. Like I like your takeaway too, Noah, of just kind of how about reframing, the language that we use and that being really a key effort in managing or constructively resolving conflicts is really just the approach and communication and like how we are saying things.
And also just, I think like creating a culture where gossip isn't tolerated, where people, where people aren't using language to like dehumanize or to make people enemies or that department or that group over there or that team, like creating a culture where language is inclusive, where we're all together, we're all on the same team.
Yeah, even just acknowledging that. I feel like so many examples are coming up in my mind right now, just about how people forget that even, especially with like larger organizations, right? Like people forget that they're still part of the same whole, the same larger team, even if they move departments or okay, they're not getting along, so I'm going to move you to this team or something, where so then that is only reinforcing these these kind of in-group, out-groups within the larger group. And I think so many times especially in larger organizations, but even smaller ones, where people are forgetting that they're part of a collective whole.
I mean, this is a really important topic, I think, in figuring out how to reduce those kinds of things, because it's so easy to build up that kind of favoritism towards your own group, and it so quickly can lead into the negative about the other people. It's a really interesting study.
Especially the part about trust towards, your in-group and how that goes hand in hand with dehumanizing the enemy. So it just, that's interesting. I mean, I can see how that would happen, but like just highlighting how important it is to not only trust the person right next to you or in your in-group, but make that effort of building trust and more distant relationships that you have within a company or within a team.
Yeah, and just kind of what your tolerance is for your own in-group behavior, right? Because that takes everyone to say what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and holding everyone accountable to not allowing those kinds of things, not that kind of language or those kinds of stereotypes about the other groups. Everyone kind of has to do their part, I think, to help move the culture in a way that moves away from that kind of mentality.
Definitely some really good points you made there. I think we've had other studies on language and the power of language within organizations, but in kind of social conflict situations like this, or sometimes intractable conflict. But super important. Sarah?
Oh, I mean, this could take us on a whole nother tangent, so I don't know that I want to go there, but I'm just thinking out loud here with what we're seeing a lot of organizations kind of struggling with, and just society in general with our equity movement and the awareness building, but people are talking about these microaggressions and like the common speech that a lot of people are still gaining awareness on and learning, and the negative repercussions that some of our common speech has. I think that's a whole nother conversation, but workplaces are also experiencing that, and they're asking about the microaggressions and what do we do with it? How do we kind of navigate that by making sure that it's an inclusive approach?
Yeah, it's a difficult subject to figure out, because I mean, if microaggressions happen within the workplace, it's hard to, I don't know. Sometimes it's hard to, first it's hard to, like, I think, tell whoever is, maybe saying that microaggression that it impacted you, because you don't know how they're going to respond. So it's like about having thoughtful dialogue and like respect for the other person, but it's difficult to do. It's a balance that you have to maintain a little bit. But I think that's an interesting takeaway. I think that really does relate to what this study is kind of all about.
There's a lot of debate in the microaggression, sort of field as to whether it is a true construct or whether it's, there's some, it hasn't really been proven to be a construct, other than the fact that people are offended by all kinds of things. And so the problem with the microaggression issue is that the needle keeps moving. We never know what actually is going to be offensive. Right. And so you could say something completely benign. Even just like the idea of like a normal, natural human thing to say is, oh, where are you from? And you could ask that of anybody. But if you are looking for offense, if your mind is sort of filtering for, oh, people are looking at me differently because I'm this way, and so they're perceiving me this way, and so I'm looking for offense, and someone asks me where I'm from, and I'm going to make the assumption that person is asking me where I'm from because they think that I'm from somewhere else, where it's really just a natural human. So there's all this sort of this balance between hypervigilance and hypersensitivity, and like what's an actual offense. And you see this now with corporations like Basecamp and Coinbase, who are making like very clear statements because they went down the sort of equity path and talking about microaggressions and anti-bias training and stuff, and it completely blew up, and it derailed the entire company. And they're like, we're done, we're not doing it anymore. And if you don't like it, here's a severance package for you, kind of thing. So because it's like, it's not helpful, and there's no clear way of dealing with it yet. No one has come up with a proven way of like, here's how we train or we do something about microaggressions, because the needle keeps moving. It's like anything could be offensive, you know. So I have a particular perspective on it, just because I'm dealing with people right now that are just, they're trying to run a company and it's just getting derailed by this culture of just hypersensitivity. And in my opinion, it is hypersensitivity. Like, not all over microaggressions are hypersensitive, but I'm just like, the things that they're telling me they're dealing with, I'm like, that's incredible that someone is actually offended by something like that, you know?
Actually, Jeremy, the example you brought up, I specifically know of that exact situation where, and it was a very diverse workplace. So I think that's worth stating, a very diverse workplace. And so it's very typical to have conversations like that because you had people from all over the world. But there was one person who they asked that question to was when he joined the team, just as a general, like, let's get to know you more. And he was very offended and got angry, and the whole conversation turned sour over that question of where are you from?
How do you get to know someone? I mean, how do you become curious about someone's experiences in life without saying, oh, so where did you grow up? What was that like? You know, people ask me that all the time. They just mean like, are you from Miami? Are you from Los Angeles? Like, and I could go into like, well, why don't you think I'm from here? You know, that kind of stuff. Or I could just go, okay, yeah, they just want to know about me. You know, it's like, it's all the way I frame it in my.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But that's interesting. And I think everything you said is a good point, though. There's no way to really, you know, without knowing people, there is no way to understand what could be, you know, someone's sensitivity versus someone else's.
And it's like, do we create a culture here of suspicion and sensitivity? Is that the culture we want? Or is the culture we want to give each other the benefit of the doubt? And if someone says something that's like, that I feel offended by, that I don't presume the person tried to offend me, or presume the person is some sort of like bigot or racist or sexist or something, and that's why they're saying, I just presume that maybe they're just trying to get to know me. Maybe they just made a comment. They have no negative intentions. Like, that's what I should presume, and then ask questions to discover if that's the case, rather than just presume guilt, you know? Because you know, in Miami, like, I'm a minority by far here, and people that are from, you know, it's 70% Latino and Latina, and people ask me, oh, where are you from? And I could easily go like, well, why don't you think I'm from here? Just because I don't speak Spanish or something like that. It's like, but I just go, no, I'm from Los Angeles, you know, like, that's where I grew up. You know, it's like, how do I want to interact with people in the world, you know?
I think that what you're talking about is so relevant and in such a large whole nother issue about language and questioning, and as you called it, kind of like being overly sensitive or hypersensitive. But in relation to this research article and language and dehumanizing others with our language and microaggressions, I think I was referring more to the stereotypical, like those types of, that type of language that clearly is a stereotype for like a certain group that is marginalized. Like I think that's kind of where I was going with it. Like people saying, you know, oh, he must be like, this person is Asian, they must be good at math, or saying to a black person, you act white, or saying to a white person, you act, like that type of language, those types of microaggressions. I think that's where my mind was going in relation to this article, and how, you know, or saying, oh, that person gypped me, like that is actually a racial slur towards gypsies, that like, you know, but that's common, I think, not always common speech, but it somewhat is, to where some of us are not even aware of the stereotype and the dehumanizing that does to certain groups. That's kind of where I was going with it. But
Yeah, no,
I
I think it's a matter of language. When you talk about microaggressions, it's even a matter of language about microaggressions, because like microaggression imply, when I hear aggression, I mean, the typical, field of aggression is that it requires intent. It requires some malice. Aggression is aggression. It's like when you start saying microaggression, you're basically kind of, it's like you're saying like, your intent, you have some malice or some intent for malice or something, but you're not aware of it or something. But it's like, but is that true? Because when you say what you're talking about, to me, it just sounds like that's a stereotype. If I say, oh, you must be smart because you're Asian, is that an aggression or is that a stereotype? Like, am I trying to be malicious with that, or am I just subject to stereotype bias? Like I'm certainly stereotyping, but is it aggressive? Is it like maybe someone I'm
well, I think that's where like the term microaggression stems from, because it's like not it that I think I'm not sure the history of that word, like where it came into play, but maybe that's why they're putting like the micro in front of it, because it's something that's almost like small, like a small hidden aggression that they are not even, some are not aware of, or it's just, or they use like humor to, let's use some levity and add humor to it. It's not a real stereotype. I don't know.
I think it stems from the intent versus impact conversation, and it's like, does impact matter more than intent? And if it does, then you can use the word microaggression. But if they're kind of equal footing, like you have to consider both. Do we really want to call a microaggression can we call it something else? I mean, can we use a different language to suggest, you know what I mean? Like, there's probably some other word that you can use, because for me, when you say microaggression, it feels like we're talking about your intent. And if someone didn't intend, they have their stereotypes, they have their biases, and they just kind of slips out, or they have a language like gypped and they have no idea where that language comes from until someone tells them and they go, oh, I didn't know that. Okay, well, I won't use it anymore. It's like they had absolutely no knowledge or intent. And to me, like, aggression means intent. So like, so I think that's where the balance would be. Like, if we had another word for microaggression, I think that would be more useful.
That makes sense. And I wonder if too, some of the way to negate that in a workplace is having a workplace that's open to, has good conflict management, so that if somebody does take that effectively, you have a way to manage that. And then keeping a, welcoming environment where education's okay, so that you can have those conversations and just generally say, hey, that's not acceptable, and here's why, without that causing a conflict, without the other person then getting defensive.
And that's why it's like, if we can have those conversations in an effective way and not demonize the person for having done it, if they didn't actually aggress, aggression is aggression. But if it's not aggression, if it's not intended to be aggressive or malicious in some way, the person made a mistake, or they didn't even recognize that they said something or something. Could we have that conversation without it turning into a conflict? And that's a safe environment to make mistakes in. And if you don't have a safe environment to make mistakes in, everyone's going to be walking on eggshells and shut down. And then innovation just completely stops, because no one wants to collaborate. No one wants to talk to each other. I don't want to say the wrong thing, so I'm not going to say anything. That's what happens at some of these companies that are sort of changing direction now. Everybody's scared to say anything.
And it's worth to say that kind of mentality, that hinders teamwork, that hinders innovation,
right.
Productivity. It affects every aspect, I think, of that work culture, plus well-being.
It's actually, it'd be an interesting thing to do, even just experiment with ourselves, even if just there's Anna Priya wrote this study about these norms of peaceful cultures, and they have these 8 points of peaceful cultures that this meta-analysis did of all these different studies. And I think, did we publish that article yet, Noah?
Early July.
Okay.
So maybe not.
It's a cool, it's a cool, and basically it's a lot of it's is the culture creating norms and values and rituals and ceremonies, etc., around peace. And it's like very salient. Peace is very salient. And it's like, could we create, I think part of that is creating an opportunity to make mistakes. Like, hey, it's okay to say what you want, to do what you want. And, you know, obviously if it's aside from being like malicious or aggressive, but it's okay to make mistakes here. And if I find something offensive, I'm not going to look to be offended. But if something offends me, I'll bring it up in a way that gives you the benefit of the doubt. I'll bring it up in a way that suggests, I don't think you actually meant this. And I just want to let you know how it impacted me. You know, rather than trying to, you know, tell you something's wrong with your brain, something's wrong with you for having done that to me. No, it's nothing's wrong with you. You just, you know, you said this and it offended me and I want you to know how to, I mean, that's just, I think, a nice culture to have. Like, hey, we can all make mistakes. We can all potentially offend each other and it's not going to erupt in this horrible conflict.
To me, that sounds like a culture of inclusion.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Every voice matters, but we're going to meet where you're at. It's like there's continual growth and learning and dialogue. It's like that. Yeah, to me, what we're describing is a culture of inclusion, which that also encompasses, you know, all the work that we do with having a dialogue to talk about conflict, normalize the discussion around conflict to come up with better solutions and initiatives.
Yeah, true inclusion. All voices and perspectives can be heard.